Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I expect to be joined in a few minutes by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. What our topic is for tonight is lessons learned from the fundraising analyses. Of course, as I'm sure you know, I've been engaged for some time now in analyses of the fundraising for something like 180 members of the House and 30 members of the Senate. The fundraising analyses have represented progressive Democrats, Freedom Caucus members of the House, Congressional Progressive Caucus members, a variety of establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans as well, and also 30 members of the Senate, 15 Democrats and 15 Republicans. It's taken quite a long time to go through these analyses because I wanted to establish certain truths. I didn't have the time to do all the members of Congress and all the members of the Senate, but I did have time to do a large sample of the fundraising facts for the 180 House members and the 30 senators. Tonight, I want to discuss the lessons learned from the fundraising analyses. Let us start by considering the rule once again that has guided our fundraising analyses. That rule is here, and it says, vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corporations, individuals, PACs, political action committees, that is, or party committees, and who repudiate all super PAC support. Well, that rule is simple enough, and what we've done is to apply it to the 180 sitting members of the House and the 30 sitting members of the Senate whose fundraising we've examined. In each case, we looked at open secrets and we noted whether the office holders had been elected while taking money from wealthy corporations, from wealthy individuals, from PACs or party committees, and whether any of the office holders who had received super PAC support actually tried to repudiate any of the super PAC support they received, to publicly call it out, and to publicly condemn, the super PAC money. And while it was impossible, of course, for the office holders to give that money back because they weren't spending it in the first place, it was possible for them to condemn it, to renounce it, and to renounce the corruption that it brings. But none actually did that. All of those who got super PAC support seem to have cheerfully accepted it. So that is the situation we have seen. And the major lesson we have learned is that every one of the 180 House members and the 30 members of the Senate whose fundraising we surveyed, okay, all of them would have failed the litmus test implied by this rule. They all took considerable money from wealthy corporations, individuals, or PACs or party committees, nor did they repudiate super PAC support. So they all bit to the dust, as we like to say around here. They were all taking money from sources that are inevitably corrupting. And in most cases, they were relying very heavily on that kind of support. While there were some folks who, as we shall see, did very well in getting small dollar donations for their campaign, even those people raised considerable amount of money, huge amounts of money, from wealthy individuals, sometimes from wealthy corps, substantial money from PACs, and in many cases, huge amounts of super PAC support. So that's why I say that each and every one of them failed, okay, the litmus test. But it's important to ask, how did they fail? What are some of the patterns we saw? So let us start to go over some case studies that we went over in much more detail here. Let us start with let us start with the North Carolina Senate race between Tom Tillis and Cal Cunningham. Okay, we recently went over that, so we can briefly review it. If we look at the summary data, we see that on that race in North Carolina, $76 million was raised and roughly $76 million was spent by the two candidates and their campaigns. But in addition to that, there was a huge amount, okay, of outside spending. Cal Cunningham was the object, either supporting or being opposed, being either supported or opposed, or opposed by almost $120 million in outside spending. And Tom Tillis was either supported or opposed by $100 million in outside spending. $220 million in outside spending was part of this campaign. That's money spent by PACs, by super PACs, okay, by carry committees, and that money absolutely dwarfed the hefty direct campaign expenses of $76 million by these two people. We were able to see when we went over that spending in detail, the particular groups that supported either Cal Cunningham or Tom Tillis with regard to the outside spending. We also went over the direct campaign spending and the sources of that particular spending. It's important, though, to look at the candidates page, which contains the breakdown of spending that occurred for these candidates. In each case, the breakdown included direct campaign spending coming from small contributions, direct campaign spending coming from large individual contributions greater than $200 per person. Who can afford to give greater than $200 to campaigns? Only people who are well off. Unfortunately, there's no further breakdown at Open Secrets of the large individual contributions. Okay, in terms of, for example, the category of $201 to $1,000, or $1,001 to, oh, I don't know, the maximum campaign contribution. I'm not even sure what it is these days, $5,000 or whatever. Okay. The point is, we could get more information with further breakdowns of the large individual contributions. But even contributions from $201 to the maximum from individuals are contributions from well-off or rich people. There were also PAC contributions that were substantial. In the case of Tom Tillis, he had PAC contributions of something like $5 million, which were almost as great as the small individual contributions that he got. So, the large individual contributions were a key factor in his failing of the litmus test. The PAC contributions were a factor, but he didn't rely on them so much as the large individual contributions from rich people. Of course, he also relied heavily on outside spending that he knew was going to come his way. And we've already seen how big that outside spending was. But what was very important in his campaign, was the large individual contributions. Those of Cal Cunningham, who did very well, by the way, in small individual contributions. He raised $17.3 million that way, but that was dwarfed by the individual contributions from the well-off and the rich of $31 million. His PAC contributions were not so important, $865,786, but they also were not as important as the outside spending, which in his case was just astonishing. In Tom Tillis's cases, it was also astonishing, and we went over that. Okay, let me get rid of that now with a note of how important the large individual contributions were. Thank you, Barney.
Margaret, can I put that on for 2 minutes?
Sure. So, I'm going to come back to the theme of the importance of large individual contributions as we go here. But I want you to know that a continuing theme in all these is going to be how important the large individual contributions are from rich, okay, and well-off people. In a way, they and the efforts of the super PACs are key to many of the races. However, the super PACs are only important in a small number of races. Races deemed to be important for control of the Senate or control of the House attract a lot of attention from the super PACs and the carry committees. And a lot of outside spending is attracted to these races. But they are a fairly small minority of races. Just off the top of my head, okay, I think super PACs were very important in about probably 5% of the races. That's deceptive in the sense that these races were often the most important ones around for control of the House or for control of the Senate. Uh, so those 5% of the races were key, but still, the important point is that, as we will see as we go through more of these examples, the large individual contributions are a constant in most of these races. They're always very important. People are failing the litmus test. Generally, the most important factor in their failure of it is the large individual contributions greater than $200 they are taking. The PAC contributions are also important in their failure, okay, the litmus test. A very common pattern is failure due to large individual contributions and failure due to PAC contributions. Less common is failure due to large individual contributions and a vast amount of outside spending. So the most common pattern is large individual contributions and PAC contributions that lead to the failure, okay, of the litmus tests. So let me go into some more cases now, and we will see this pattern. In selecting some of these races, I have been biased towards races where the super PACs were also very important. In many more typical races, which we can look up at some later time, the super PACs are not so important. I should say the independent expenditures from super PACs, carry committees, and PACs are not so important. But the individual contributions from well-off people are always important. Okay, so let's look. Let me share again. I want to look now at the New York District 14 race. Some of you may recognize that this is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's race. In 2022, she raised $12.3 million, spent $11.1 million, emerged with cash on hand from previous races she had run of $5.2 million. So she had a war chest of $5.2 million at the end of this particular campaign. Was there outside spending in her race? Yes. She was supported by $2,719 in outside spending and opposed by $141,280. So the super PAC spending in her race was not nearly as important as the direct campaign contributions. Okay. Let us now look at the candidates page for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and there we will see something of the pattern which is dominant. By the way, in her reelection campaign, this was a second reelection campaign, a third campaign. She got 70.6% of the vote. Her small individual contributions were impressive. 68% of what she got, $8,327,902. But her large individual contributions from rich and well-off people, $3.9 million. And she got some PAC contributions. But that wasn't really determinative in terms of her flunking the litmus test. The big factor was large individual contributions. So again, I highlight how important that sort of thing is. To go back to the previous page here, the super PAC spending. Was not really that significant in this race. There was the opposition to her of 141.3 thousand dollars. So that was a fairly small factor. So mostly she won by virtue of the small dollar donations and the large individual donations, but the large individual donations, obviously she relied on those, though as we shall see, not to the same extent as certain other candidates. Now, in previous elections with Ocasio-Cortez, you'll see a little bit of a different pattern. I'm going to look at the 2020 race for illustration. There she faced competition that was stiffer. They hoped to defeat her. She raised $20.7 million for this campaign. Outside spending in opposition to her was $145,000. So again, the outside spending wasn't really that important. But when we go to the breakdown of how that money was raised, and when we go to the candidates page for that campaign, we see that pattern was there. $16.4 million in small individual contributions, 80% of what she raised. But here it was $4.2 million from the well-off, and the rich, in this campaign. Now, from the standpoint of failing or passing the litmus test, Ocasio-Cortez is obviously one of the Congress people who comes closest to passing. But still, she relied substantially on contributions from well-off and rich people, $4.2 million worth. Let's leave Ocasio-Cortez and go to a California District 47 candidate. For those who are not aware, the 2022 race of Katie Porter was really quite astonishing as a case in point. Katie Porter raised $25.7 million for this race. She spent $28.5 million, yet had enough money saved up from previous from previous races, that she emerged with $7.4 million in the cash on hand. Look at the outside spending: 751,786 in favor of Katie Porter, but 9.2 million opposed to Katie Porter. That's a net loss of about $8.4 million. So she had a huge advantage in the direct campaign spending, but that advantage was cut into considerably by the outside spending, which she did not try to repudiate from the PACs and from the carry committees. She had a huge advantage in spending over Scott Bohr, the Republican competition, 28.5 million to 3 million. That is what, 7 times, 8 times, close to 9 times the advantage in direct spending. But then her lead there was cut into considerably by negative campaigning from in the form of independent expenditures from groups that really wanted to defeat her in this race. But let's look at the candidates page here, and let's see what was so very important in her victories. She did well in the small dollar fundraising, $14.3 million. Very impressive in raising small dollar donations. She has quite a machine there. But the large individual contributions, greater than $200, $10.5 million. Certainly vital to her victory here. She won by only a small amount. The large individual contributions were key. She took some PAC money, 692,000, but that amount was dwarfed by the small individual contributions and the large individual contributions. So she failed the litmus test too. She again was one of those who came closest to passing it. To passing it, she would have had to have given up 10.5 million in large individual contributions and 691,000 in the area of PAC money. But she still would have had plenty of money to get her message out there. And it's debatable whether that would have cost her the race. But the main point here is to recognize the role of the large individual contributions, and I'll explain later why I think that is so important. Okay, so first of all, let me get this off the screen, and let me welcome Dee Pierce, the host
Hello.
of Around the World with Dee and Friends, who is joining us here. So Dee, I've been going forward with some case studies. First of all, I could easily draw the conclusion, of course, that everyone failed the litmus test.
Yes.
Now, what I'm trying to highlight is the reason why, the primary reason why they failed it.
Okay.
Okay, and in this, I'm showing the role of large individual contributions uh, in certain races for the Senate and the House that I'm using, okay, to illustrate the role. Okay, let's look at the next race, which is the race for the Senate of John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. Admittedly, this is not a typical race in spending. Okay, it was ridiculous, but we already saw that the race for the Senate in North Carolina between Tom Tillis and Cal Cunningham was also ridiculous. And you
Hmm.
saw the extreme role of super PAC spending, independent spending in that, as well as the major role played by large individual contributions, okay, in that race on both sides. Here is the race for the Pennsylvania District 12 in 2022, specifically Summer Lee's race, where she was victorious. Uh, she raised $1.8 million. She spent roughly $1.8 million, came out of it with only $24,367. Uh, but when we look at the outside spending, uh, that was important in this race. Okay, remember that this race will not be, uh, they won't spend as much money in this race because it's a House race. Okay, the two House races you've seen so far uh, are the races of AOC, okay, and also Katie Porter. Those were extraordinary in the total amount of money that was raised for the direct campaigns. But even there, you saw in Katie Porter's campaigns, there was a tremendous amount of outside spending, independent spending, in opposition to Katie Porter in that campaign. Uh, Now, here's more outside spending in the Summer Lee race. She was supported by $2.907 million in outside spending, but she was opposed by $3.28 million, okay, in outside spending. Her main opponent, Steve Irwin, and this was in the primary. The primary spending was very important. It was huge for a primary, okay, in the House. Steve Irwin, though, her main opposition, okay, another Democrat, was supported by 1.133 in outside spending and opposed by only $1,520 in outside spending. This is significant because he was net positive uh, by roughly $1.1 million, where she had a net loss, okay, of roughly, what is that, maybe $300,000. So he gained a big advantage, okay, in the outside spending, and that big advantage uh, kind of made up for. Well, I don't see the direct spending, okay, for the primaries, so I cannot tell you, okay, what it made up for, but clearly the outside spending was very, very important for Summer Lee in her victory in the primaries. Uh, okay, but it was negatively important. It benefited Steve Irwin, okay, in the primaries. Okay. In the general election, Summer Lee had it her way what was important in that particular victory. Let's go to the candidates page and we'll see. Okay, there again, we see small individual contributions, 594,590, 32% of what she raised. But her large individual contributions, so let's be clear here. Summerlee was a small d Democratic favorite. She was a representative of the working class. She was basically a Bernie Sanders candidate. But she raised more in large individual contributions than she did in small individual contributions, even though she had a pretty effective ground game, and that's how she won. She also took 349,219 in PAC contributions. But I want to draw attention here to the overwhelming importance of the large individual contributions. Her flunking of the litmus test was based on her substantial PAC contributions and her large individual contributions, which is a pattern we often see, especially in the House races. But again, the large individual contributions have been important in every race we have seen so far. And once again, we have to note those are contributions from well off and rich people. If they're getting these contributions, if candidates are getting these contributions, they must be eliciting them partly on the basis of their appeal to these well off and rich individuals. We'll talk about the possible effects of that at a later time. But so far, we've seen that in all four of the races that we've examined thus far. Let's go on. Let's quit. I don't even know if I was sharing this one. But let me quit it. Let me go back to Pennsylvania and share the Senate race in 2022 there, which was, of course, a hugely interesting race. The race between John Fetterman and Dr. Mehmet Oz. So, here are the summary figures. John Fetterman raised $75.1 million, spent $74.5 million, came out with cash on hand of $627,350. Okay, Dr. Oz spent $50.9 million, spent $49.2 million. He emerged with $1.7 million, okay, from the campaign. But here's the outside spending. For John Fetterman, the outside spending in support of his campaign was $40,173,000. In opposition to him, $84,103,000 was spent. So he was negative 44 million in the outside spending category. However, Dr. Oz was supported by $16.3 million in outside spending and opposed by $94.5 million, okay, in outside spending. So he was negative not by $44 million, but by $78 million. Can you imagine? Negative by $78 million. So John Fetterman, as much advantage as he lost from the outside spending, 44 million, he still had an advantage of 34 million in terms of net loss over Dr. Oz. So the outside spending probably had a lot to do with the outcome in this race. But when we look at the candidates tab here, we see that in the direct campaign spending area, even though John Fetterman was very popular with small dollar donors and raised 37 million in small dollar donors, an enormous amount, and 49% of what he raised, the large individual contributions from the well-off and rich folks were 31.3 million, or 42% of what he raised. He also had some back contributions of 810,235. So he failed the litmus test. He failed it largely because he took so much money in large individual contributions. Would he have won against ours if he had foregone those contributions? Well, we don't know. If both candidates were running in an environment that was toxic to the large individual contributions, which is an environment that we're trying to generate, then it seems to me that John Fetterman would have had a great advantage over Dr. Oz. But let us see. Uh, yep, Dr. Oz had only 7.7 million in small individual contributions. But in large individual contributions, including his own candidate self financing, he had close to $40 million in large individual contributions. Those were critical to his near success. Both people, of course, failed the litmus test. So, once again, we see the pattern of how important the large individual contributions were in the failure of the litmus tests. And we have to ask the question, what are the candidates offering to the large individual contributors that they get these large individual contributions? I mean, for someone such as John Fetterman, who's basically running as a working class type of candidate, it isn't surprising that he raised $37 million in small dollar donations. But it is surprising that he also raised $31.3 million in the area of the large individual contributions. So as we go forward, we're going to come back to what I think that may mean. So here we are. Our next race is the main Senate race. Let me present that and get it into the stream. That was the race where Susan Collins ran against Sarah Gideon once again. Susan Collins raised nearly $30 million in this campaign. Sarah Gideon raised $74.5 million in this campaign. Susan Collins spent $29.6 million in this campaign. Sarah Gideon spent $62.9 million in this campaign. Sarah Gideon left $11.6 million on the table, cash on hand. Not very bright of her. This was a close race. Okay, it was won by just a few points by Susan Collins. Would she have won if Sarah Gideon had spent that $11.6 million instead of holding on to it? The fact that she had that $11.6 million okay, at the end, that's an artifact of very poor planning. But that's not a hint there to my main points, which I'll get to. Getting to the outside spending in that race, that was a race that was very unusual in terms of the outside spending. $8.6 million supported Susan Collins in that race. But she was opposed by $48 million. So she had a net loss in outside spending of nearly $40 million. But Sarah Gideon was supported by $12.7 million in outside spending. She was opposed by only $42 million. So she was negative roughly $28 million. So negative close to $40 million versus negative $28 million. Sarah Gideon had the advantage in outside spending, even though both were in a negative loss position with respect to outside spending. But when we move over to the candidates page here, we see that for both candidates, the large individual contributions were critical. For Susan Collins, her small individual contributions were only $5.9 million. Her large individual contributions from the well-off and the rich were $19.3 million. Her PAC contributions were $3.4 million. So again, you see the importance of the large individual contributions in this race. Now, taking large individual contributions, once again, is prohibited by the rule. Candidates should not be taking money from individuals who are rich. Obviously, all the candidates we've seen so far have been doing that. Susan Collins was no exception, okay, to that rule. I should add that even though the PAC contributions are important here and were an element in her failing, okay, the litmus test, they're nowhere near as important as the large individual contributions. So moving on, okay, we get to Sarah Gideon. By the way, Sarah Gideon actually was beaten pretty badly in this. Susan Collins got 51.1% of the vote, but Sarah Gideon only got 42.2% of the vote. So I don't know, even if she spent the 11.6 million, I don't know whether she would have been able to pick it up. But small individual contributions for Sarah Gideon, $30 million. But large individual contributions, $43 million. PAC contributions, relatively small, 727 million. So again, we see the key role of the large individual contributions. Okay, still not convinced of the importance of these individual contributions. Uh, let's look at a one-party district for the Democrats for a minute. Let's look at Rashida Tlaib's race is the first one to come to mind. Let's look at her race for a minute. Okay. She was in Michigan District 12, which is a one-party district, heavily Democratic. The Republicans have no chance, especially if the candidate is a popular one. So, and Rashida is fairly popular. So this is a House race. So remember, the spending will be less. Rashida raised 3.3 million.
Oh, excuse me, Joe. You're not on the screen. You don't have it on.
Thank you, Dee. Thank you, Dee, for reminding me. Let me get that up on the screen. Okay. We're sharing the screen here again. Okay, so $3.3 million, spent $3.4 million, cash on hand $237 million. Her opponent, who's a Republican in a heavily Democratic district, and who national Republicans were not supporting, raised $252,334, spent $248,053, emerged with cash on hand of $42.82. Outside spending in this race was not very important, but another Democrat by the name of Janice Winfrey, don't know whether she's any relation to Oprah, got $678,470 in outside spending in her favor and was opposed by zero spending. In Rashida's case, she had $55,543 in outside spending supporting her, but she was opposed by $140,833. But in this race, relatively speaking, the outside spending was not very important because it was a relatively quiet race. The Republicans had decided they were not able to defeat her, so they let Democrats essentially fight among themselves, uh, and they abandoned this race, not really trying to compete in it. Let's go to the candidates tab. Okay, now Rashida is a working class candidate as well. In small individual contributions, $864,000, about 27% of what she raised. Large individual contribution, $2.1 million, 65% of what she raised. Now I can keep on showing you cases where again and again, it's not the PAC money that's overwhelmingly important. It's not the outside spending that is overwhelmingly important, but in almost every race that we focused on, and there were races where the outside spending was overwhelmingly important. There were races where the PAC money was very important. But the pattern again and again showed that a substantially important category was always the large individual contributions for the candidate. So let me draw out what I think the big lesson is from this. Now, the first lesson we talked about was the lesson everybody failed, the litmus test. So if people were voting according to the rule, everyone would be defeated if they didn't change their behavior. Now, I expect that draws like Katie Porter and AOC would change their behavior not take any of the large individual contributions, and probably still win their races because their small individual contributions were so substantial. But for most of the current incumbents, if they didn't get the large individual contributions, or people voted against them because they were taking the large individual contributions, uh, they would fall to a candidate who was primarily relying on small individual contributions. And the heart of the campaigns of almost all the candidates is efforts at fundraising among the well off and the rich individuals. That's the category that is most important. That's a very important lesson that we learned with all of the surveys, okay, that we did. Now let's ask, what is the likely effect of that, okay, on American politics, both on the Republican side and on, okay, the Democratic side? I think the effect of the reliance of candidates on rich and well-off people for donations greater than $200 means that both of the major political parties tilt towards the right of where their mass voting support is. The mass voting support doesn't come from the well off individuals. There may be in the top 10% or less of the voting population.
Mm-hmm.
But that segment of the population then is buying the elections. It's buying the elections when the Republicans win. It's buying the elections when the Democrats win.
Yes, they are.
And that means that the Democrats have to be careful that they don't make the rich and well off people in their district angry at them because they're perceived as too lefty. And on the Republican side, the same goes for Republicans who are too righty, by and large, because the two parties have to rely on the campaigns of the rich and the well off donors. They moderate to some degree what they would normally advocate for. Okay, the Republicans are not quite as extremely pro business as they might otherwise be. Okay, and the Democrats are not as much for the people as they, okay, would otherwise be. I conclude, okay, by saying that if the rule was followed and the candidates were penalized for taking donations from the well off, okay, and the rich, that we would soon have Congresses that would not be beholden to the well off, okay, and the rich,
That's true.
and that might be much more responsive to the people, both on the left and on the right.
Great. The problem is the big money in politics. We see it everywhere where money is the problem.
We see everywhere that money is the problem. In certain individual races, as I pointed out, maybe 5% of the races, the super PAC money becomes hugely important in shifting a race in one way, okay, or another. But for most races, it's not the super PAC money that counts. It's not even the PAC money that counts so much. The dominant money is from the rich and the well off individuals who can afford to make more than $200 donations to campaigns. So while the rule is correct in penalizing candidates for uh, their super PAC support, for their PAC support, uh, where it really bites is relative to their support from which from the rich, okay, and well-off people. If they couldn't have that support because the public were to vote against people who took that support, then we would clean up the role of money in politics very quickly. So I think that's the second lesson, okay, that we've learned. And it may be the most important one because I don't think it's been realized, generally speaking, that all of the candidates, to some degree, are pandering to the rich, okay, and the well off, and are adjusting their campaign strategies so that the money keeps coming in from the rich, okay, and the well off. I think at an aggregate level, that's what's going on, okay, in our elections. And I think that's why so many nothing bills are passed that don't really rock the boat. And the legislation that would be rocking the boat is studiously avoided by members of both political parties. So there we go. In future broadcasts, what I will be doing is going deeply into current campaigns and the people who will be running in 2024. And to the extent that I'm able, I will be tracking the campaign expenditures of Congress people and senators and the campaign contributions going to Congress people, okay, and the senators. And I'll start doing that actually next week, even though it's kind of early. And we'll probably be doing a lot of that. There probably isn't a lot of data yet on what kind of spending is going to what kind of people. But as the months go by, there'll be more and more data on it. And we'll see how the flood of money is coming in and where it is coming in from. And in every case, we will be paying attention to the role of the rich and the well off people in raising the necessary money uh, for the candidates who are running to be successful. So, Dee, any more comments?
I think it sounds good that what you're doing is getting into, we saw how things were. We saw the past. And then we'll go into the present. What's happening on the ground, I think, is a really good idea.
Yes, and by talking about it, and by critiquing it, we will see if the candidates begin to respond. We will see if we can get a campaign going to dump
Mm-hmm.
corruption.
Right, because we definitely need to dump this corruption.
So, a few candidates, I'm sorry, a few comments from our folks. Robert Copeland says, Joe, all the politicians that you've shown here failed the litmus test. Yeah, all the politicians we studied over the last months failed it. Jeff Denton says, Hillary would call Ukraine a business opportunity. Probably she would. She is that evil.
Oh, definitely.
And Sandy Degg gives the broadcast a thumbs up. Thank you, Sandy. I'm glad you're back. I bet you've been on vacation for some time. Okay, so I think that's all for tonight. And that's all for this week. Will I be back on Tuesday night? I don't know. Probably that's on July 4th, of course. So I suppose what I'll be doing is watching the news, especially the international news.
Definitely.
Okay, I may be going on if the international news turns out to be very important. But otherwise, I'll probably take July 4th off.
Okay.
I don't know whether Dee will be having shows on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, but I think there's a good chance if she is, I'll be joining one of those shows. Okay, during this period of time.
We'll probably have a show on Monday because Greg's going to be doing Saturday and Sunday. He has the show at 9:00 talking about the climate, the environment. So he welcomes us on his show.
Okay,
So,
I may drop in for one of those. I'll see how things are going for the rest of this weekend.
that's basically it. See how things are going.
It's Bonnie's birthday weekend, so
You want to celebrate.
we're trying to celebrate a little. And so we're going to have a good time this weekend.
That sounds great. And if people haven't had a chance, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share.
Oh, and please buy us coffees.
Please.
We're thirsty.
Yes.
We need coffees.
Yes, we do. Definitely.
So we both have buy me coffee accounts. Please do occasionally buy us something. St. Deck says, no vacation. I've been busy with some health stuff. Okay, and buddy with my mother. She's in assisted living. I'm sorry, Sandy. I know assisted living is a tough deal these days. And Steve Ghoststart is here. He gives a turquoise person waving and says, "Happy birthday, Bonnie."
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And Sandy says, "Happy birthday,"
Thank you.
and leaves a lot of icons that I cannot see in this in the comment interface here. So thanks, everyone, and good night. And Bonnie is the bomb. Well, I certainly agree that Bonnie is the bomb. Thank you. Thank you for both of us. Okay, good night, folks.
Yes, I'll see you over the weekend.
And also have a wonderful weekend. We will probably see you over the weekend, but have a wonderful weekend anyway. It is normally a celebratory weekend. Good night.